And change. The world of politics provides rich ground for event trading and analysis. In fact, it is so fertile that I'm devoting 2 chapters to this area. This chapter is devoted to change in the party in power, and how that impacts the financial markets. Like loaf economics, this is an imperfect science and there are many qualifications of the events impacting the markets. Some political change is sudden, turbulent, and easy to see like Argentina's in 2001. Other change is more subtle with longer time horizons such as the 1994 shift in the U.S. House of Representatives. As in all the chapters, our goal here is not to develop a specific model that fits all types, but rather a general paradigm that we can use to analyze most of the changes in government that occur and how to make money from them. The 3 events we examine span a broad spectrum of change. We'll look at these chronologically as I believe each event would have been studied by political parties around the world and learned from so as to not repeat exactly the same mistakes. We look at the 1994 U.S. midterm elections, the 2001 Argentina presidential elections, and the 2005 German federal elections. The U.S. midterm elections had the Democratic Party lose control of the U.S. House of Representatives for the first time in 40 years and put in place the cast of characters who would see a U.S. president impeached. The 2001 Argentina political and economy crisis would see the head of government change 3 times in less than 2 weeks and cause the country to massively devalue its currency. Finally, the 2005 German elections were fascinating in that all of the fun and positive mojo by the victorious party would be squandered before it actually took office. 171. 172. Politics. 1994 U.S. midterm elections. The rise and fall of Gingrich. The U.S. 1994 elections for the House of Representatives and the Senate were a watershed event for numerous reasons. First and foremost, the outcome marked a change of the party in power in the House for the first time since 1954. Next, the outcome marked the first time in 40 years that Republicans controlled both houses of Congress. Last, it marked the first time that a sitting Speaker of the House, Tom Foley, would lose his seat during an election since the U.S. Civil War in 1865. The Republicans gained 54 seats and took control of the House of Representatives. In the Senate they gained 8 seats and defended all 13 of their seats that were up for election. The Republicans also gained 12 more governor seats in the states around the country. This is why it is so important to review that year and understand the changes that occurred and how those changes continue to impact U.S. politics to this day. The outcome was the culmination of tremendous change in the Republican political leadership and ushered in a dramatic change in Congress. Congress had been a bastion of power for committees and the chairman of those committees reigned supreme up until about the mid-1970s. Then via a series of scandals and new blood demanding change, these chairmanships were eroded until more power could be distributed to those who utilized a key new instrument in the legislative process, television. The advent of C-SPAN and the broadcasting of congressional speech has dramatically changed the way that members of Congress could get their messages or opinions out to the public. No one understood that better than Republican Newt Gingrich. Scandal, then a contract. Congressman and then Speaker of the House Gingrich began laying the groundwork for taking over power in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Gingrich and the Republicans constantly attacked the Democrats and kept them on the defensive, whether it was Tim Wright's book dealer Dan Rostenkowski's felony indictment for abuse of House stamps or President Bill Clinton's investment in Whitewater. More important, the Republicans hung together and stayed united behind defeating President Bill Clinton and First Lady Hillary Clinton's health care proposal that both Clintons had staked as a key piece of legislation for the Democrats. It never even got to a vote in Congress. The Republicans did an amazing job of blocking all the attempts by the Democrats to bring any important legislation to a vote during the election year. To some extent, this continues in Congress to this day during government change. 173. Election years. This is why all important bills must be brought up in the preceding year and why you can honestly say that members of Congress work for only half of their time in D.C. Late in the 1994 campaign, Gingrich and 300 Republican leaders appeared on the steps of the Capitol to announce their contract with America, in which they pledged to carry out a 10-point platform to reform Congress and pass major pieces of conservative legislation in the first 100 days of their rule. I remember watching the event in the trading room as all the major news outlets covered the story. It was a coup for the Republicans and fueled their victory. After the elections, a state of political gridlock ensued as the Republicans controlled both houses of Congress legislative and the Democrats held the presidency executive. Fishes implications for the markets. From a common sense standpoint, a gridlocked government means in general one of two scenarios can exist. In scenario 1, the two sides work together and compromise over what the priorities for new legislation and for spending will be. This means that neither side gets to do exactly what they want or spend exactly what they want. Therefore, government expenditures generally are contained, because no strong agenda gets favored, like health care. In scenario 2, the sides don't work together, they don't compromise, and no one gets anything close to what they want. At best, this means that budget bills get passed and ongoing spending is at the same levels and same priorities as the year before. At worst, this means that the battles that flare up can escalate to a point where Congress refuses to pass budgets and debt ceilings for spending so that the government is effectively shut down. This latter scenario is precisely the path that the Republican Congress went down with Democrat Bill Clinton. The acrimonious relationship between the Democrats and the Republicans led to partisan fighting and very little compromise. This meant that very little legislation got done without it being dragged on via extended debate. This included spending bills and meant that Congress would not overspend or increase dramatically the amount of money dedicated to new initiatives. Keep in mind, this was all happening after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the need to increase defense spending had dropped as well. Market reaction. Let's get to what was going on in the markets. As always, let's look at what the U.S. Federal Reserve was doing at the time. Throughout 1994, the Fed and Alan Greenspan were aggressively raising rates. They took federal funds rate from 3.00% at the start of the year to 5.50% at the end of the year, figure 10.1. They would raise rates to a peak of 6.00% in 174. Politics. Figure 10.1 U.S. Federal funds rate. Source. Used with permission from Bloomberg LP. February. Look at what the generic U.S.10-year government note was doing, figure 10.2. It comes as no surprise that the yield was rising along with the Federal Reserve raising rates. This set the stage for a massive rally in 1995 when the Fed began to cut rates and we had a gridlocked government. Note that the Fed cut rates only 50 basis points in 1995, but the yield on the 10-year note dropped from almost 250 basis points, from 8.00% to 5.50%. Putting it another way, the yield on the 10-year was back down to the level it had started from in 1994, but the Fed funds rate at the end of 1995 was a whopping 250 basis points above where it had been at the beginning of 1994. For stocks, clearly 1994 was not a good year, as the market was digesting the beginning of a monetary tightening cycle and uncertainty over the change in the government. In figure 10.3, the Dow Industrials started the year at the peak and immediately went south upon the Federal Reserve raising rates. Once the Fed policymakers changed their cycle to an easing one and the gridlocked government was in place, the Dow boomed and had one of the best years on record. Interestingly enough, large capitalization stocks outperformed the small cap stocks in this rally, which could be interpreted to mean that no Republican congressman could get the goodies. Government change 175 figure 10.2 U.S. generic 10-year government bond source, used with permission from Bloomberg L.P. Figure 10.3 Dow Jones Industrial Average source, used with permission from Bloomberg L.P. 176. Politics. For his district and spread them out to the smaller companies. Or it could mean that the small companies didn't have a lobbying presence in D.C. to get any meaningful spending legislation sent their way. Extending this bickering and fighting to the ultimate showdown, 1996 saw the spending battles of President Clinton and the Gingrich-led Republicans shut down the federal government. Take a look at how the U.S. dollar index, the generic U.S. 10-year Treasury note, and the Dow Industrials responded. This is the ultimate example of gridlock, and all other types of gridlock should be seen as a watered-down version of this. Circling back, this is why the elections of 1994 were so important and laid the groundwork for the travails of both Gingrich and Clinton that ensued as one lost his job and one got impeached. Argentine 2001 elections in crisis. At the end of 2001, the world had a low-tone split. The unprecedented attacks on the United States at the Pentagon and World Trade Center, a biological attack, the ensuing war in Afghanistan, and Enron, the largest corporate collapse in the history of the United States. However, the world was not distracted from the problems of a nation in the southern hemisphere that was once a proud and prosperous country that enjoyed the highest standard of living in Latin America. The events in 2001 and 2002 were triggered by a collapse in the economy in 1999 with a decrease in the gross domestic product (GDP). Of course, the seeds of this economic destruction were planted long before and had Toto with trying to solve another problem that was endemic for Latin America: inflation. In 1989, Argentina's inflation hit 200% per month and topped 3,000% on an annual basis. In an effort to deal with the problem, Argentina did something radical. It fixed the value of the currency to the US dollar. Any citizen or company could go to the bank and exchange the Argentine peso in a one trade for the US dollar. This meant that Argentina effectively had the same monetary policy as the United States and therefore had the same central bank deciding this policy, the Federal Reserve. This also meant that as the Federal Reserve raised and lowered interest rates that Argentina would effectively have the same thing happen regardless of whether its economy was in the same part of the business cycle as the United States. It also meant that as the US dollar rose, the Argentine peso would rise as well. Another problem associated with this arrangement was that it necessitated that there was no leakage of additional pesos being put into the government change 177 system that the Argentine central bank didn't have U.S. Reserve Esto backup. You have to essentially freeze the pesos in circulation to match your US dollar reserves, or you have to grow the amount of US dollar reserves to match the growth of your pesos in circulation. Unfortunately for Argentina, neither of these occurred and US dollars left the system due to money laundering and massive tax evasion. At the same time, currency devaluations by Argentina's major trade partners and a stronger overall US dollar made Argentine exporters uncompetitive and dried up money flowing into the country from their activities. Last, Argentina never curbed its appetite for taking on additional debt to fuel growth. It never took the difficult political medicine of raising taxes and reducing government spending to improve its finances and therefore reduce its dependency on borrowing, especially loans from the International Monetary Fund (IMF). The IMF had lent Argentina $11 billion over the previous 2 years in hopes of avoiding a currency collapse and default. The IMF made the loan so tough it knew that the Argentine government would not make the hard choices to improve the country's finances. U.S. Treasury officials had argued that the problem was just too much debt and that the Argentine government had to borrow increasingly larger sums just to meet the debt payments. Due to the link between the peso and the US dollar, Argentina could not monetize this debt by simply printing more pesos to pay it off. Of course, it didn't help when new U.S. Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill convinced other industrialized nations to stop lending from the IMF in August of 2001. At the time, Argentina had amassed an astounding $132 billion of debt. The irony is that O'Neill eventually agreed to another $8 billion loan after Argentine Economic Minister Domingo Cavallo pleaded for 2 weeks for more time to carry out doomed reform. While this was occurring in 2001, fears of currency devaluation caused tremendous flight of capital out of the country and further stressed the currency peg system. When a November swap of Argentine debt essentially signaled a default, the government froze all bank accounts for 12 months. The people started protesting, and political instability ensued. Government after government resigned amidst the turmoil while 5 different presidents came and went, not exactly a process that would instill confidence in anyone who might be dumb enough to lend money to Argentina at the time. This is why I wrote this note to clients on January 4, 2002. And into Argentina, the slowest train wreck in the history of financial disasters. It officially devalued its currency by 29% and ended a 10-year-old peg to the US dollar. The new peso will be fixed at 1.4 per dollar and the government will let the peso trade freely within a few months. We are in a collapse. We are broke. That means we 178. Politics. Have to be very prudent, said Economic Minister Reams. Most debt holders to this country took a hit a long time ago, so there is little excitement or fear of dislocation occurring in the financial markets. The only people who have been hurt are those who didn't have the political or criminal influence to have gotten their money out of the banks when accounts were frozen. Argentines need to understand that capitalism didn't fail, but their leaders did. The new programs that are being talked about to help that country remind me of a sitcom, that 70s show. Because that's the time period they are coming from. And anyone who believes protectionism during a time of recession is a good idea hasn't studied the Great U.S. Depression of the 1930s. A mountain of debt, $132 billion, a recession, and higher taxes have all led a very wealthy nation to be humiliated. Let's do the numbers, then, on what happened. The currency was taken off the peg of 1 and devalued in 2002 to about 1 figure 10.4. Eventually, the currency was allowed to float and inflation went nuts, rising to 80%. The Argentine Merval stock index went down in anticipation of the devaluation and then rose after it, figure 10.5. This is pretty astounding, that the panic that was caused leading up to the devaluation. Figure 10.4 US dollar versus Argentine peso source, used with permission from Bloomberg LP. Government change. 179. Figure 10.5 Argentine Merval stock index source, used with permission from Bloomberg LP. Provided an amazing opportunity to buy Argentine stocks very cheaply. The key would have been to wait until the devaluation occurred and then buy the stocks when they dipped back below 300, as this would have reduced the currency risk. Today, there are exchange-traded funds (ETFs) that allow you to invest in this area of the world without having to buy the currency. The government's next ploy for stemming the flood of money out of the country. Pacification. If there ever was something that sounded like an incurable financial disease, pacification was it. All bank accounts would be converted from US dollars into Argentine pesos at the official rate of 1.4 pesos to the US dollar. Consumer spending collapsed, importers of foreign goods went bankrupt, the national airline had to stop all international flights at times, and THEU's government put restrictions on food and drugs coming from Argentina due to fears that they were inferior. Finally, the government defaulted on its debt, which caused tremendous angst in Europe, where pensioners in Italy, France, and Germany had owned the paper and now were experiencing tremendous losses. As a follow-up to this story, the Argentines did pay down some of their debts and bondholders received somewhere between 25 and 35 cents on the dollar for their bonds. In January 2006, the government of Argentina made a payment to the IMF to cover its debts. The government still owes 180. Politics. Approximately $123 billion in debt that was restructured at much lower terms and tied to the overall economic performance of the economy. Most of the financial markets could see this coming back in 1997-1998 during the Asian currency crisis and adjusted their portfolios accordingly. Unfortunately, the biggest losers of this crisis were the citizens of Argentina, who were not so connected that they could get their money out of country before the massive devaluation occurred. 2005 German federal elections. Like the Argentine elections and crisis, the party on this event started well before the election took place. Although there was no extreme economic crisis, the economy's poor performance was central to the election process as it continued to experience double-digit unemployment and low GDP. At the time, Germany was ruled by a governing coalition of the Socialist Democratic Party (SPD) and the Green Party. Chancellor Gerhard Schr Dierissus had been at the head of the coalition from 1998 and had recently remained in power by opposing the invasion of Iraq during a 2002 election. Unfortunately for his coalition, the voters perceived him to be ineffectual in bringing significant change to the moribund German economy and to bringing positive change to the welfare state in the country. Schr Dierissus had been very successful in bringing changes into energy policy by funding Green Party initiatives for renewable energy and reducing nuclear energy. In 2003, he pledged to reform the welfare state, cut taxes, and bring Germany back to world prominence. I think he included a cure for cancer, but I'm not sure. The point is that his coalition delivered very little on this Agenda 2010, and his poll ratings began to drop. At this time, he decided to make a calculated risk in forcing a fall election after a motion of no confidence passed on July 1, 2005. The ruling German was not alone in his problems. Here's what I wrote to clients on May 25. And sagging is exactly what's happening to the fortunes of most ruling European politicians. Germany's Chancellor Schr Dierissus has called for early elections in September in an attempt to catch the opposition wrong-footed with an unpopular leader. But with his party 17 points behind at this point, I kinda don't think it matters. Italy's Berlusconi had to form a new government, shocker, last month with his country in a full-blown recession. And last but certainly not least, in a country that is near and dear to most Americans, France is struggling with the referendum on an EU constitution that it helped write. Underscoring the fact that most Frenchmen are unhappy with current government change. 181. President Jacques Chirac, the opinion polls are showing between a 3 and 8% no vote against the 448-article text that has almost nothing controversial in it. On May 20, European Commissioner José Barroso said that a defeat would be perceived outside of Europe as a failure for Europe. He added that there is no plan B if it fails. Adding insult to injury, the UK is preparing for a vote on the constitution next year. However, newly re-elected Tony Blair astutely put it this way: "You can't have a vote on nothing." At the time, the German and Italian business executives seemed to be having a contest over who could be the most pessimistic. German business confidence fell to the lowest level in 21 months, with the IFO Institute reporting that its survey showed a drop to 92.9 in May from 93.3 in April. Not to be outdone, Italian confidence dropped from 84.8 to 84.2, according to the Institute for Studies and Economic Analyses (ISAE). Also, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development (OECD) reduced its growth forecast for the Eurozone at 1.2% and said Europe was dragging down the global economy. The German opposition parties of the Christian Democratic Union (CDU) and the Christian Social Union (CSU), with their junior partner the Free Democratic Party (FDP), had to win over 50% of the vote to govern in an outright majority position. The leader of the CDU was Angela Merkel. She was campaigning on personal and business tax cuts along with reforming the government to cut social spending. In July, Merkel and the CDU, CSU, FDP coalition had a 21-point lead. There was great hope in the financial markets that Germany would have a letter and a mandate to change the structure of the economy and promote growth by reducing tax burdens and decreasing regulations on German businesses. From May through August, the German DAX figure 10.6 rallied on these hopes. Also helping, the European Central Bank had cut interest rates to a new low of 2.0% figure 10.7 and kept them there for almost 2 years. Even the beleaguered euro seemed to take some comfort from the direction of Germany and stabilized in the low 1.20s against the US dollar figure 10.8. But all was not to be so simple. Schr Diarissus Oder had not survived 7 years at the helm of Germany without being able to resurrect himself and his coalition. It also helped that Merkel made a series of missteps, from confusing the difference between net and gross income figures to seriously bad hair. The worst mistake Merkel made was having a debate with the telegenic and ready for primetime Schr Diarissus Oder. She appeared awkward, and voters didn't like her flat tax proposal. By midweek, the SPD coalition came within a couple of percentage points of the CDU coalition, the QS that neither showed an ability to be able to garner an outright majority with any. 182. Politics. Figure 10.6 German DAX stock index source, used with permission from Bloomberg LP. Figure 10.7 European Central Bank refi rate source, used with permission from Bloomberg LP. Government change. 183. Figure 10.8 Euro versus US dollar. Source, used with permission from Bloomberg LP. Of their coalitions, on September 18, exit polls showed that the CDU had won, but with a razor-thin margin of victory over the SPD of 35% to 34%. Both sides claimed victory, as neither side could form a ruling majority outright within their coalitions. Here's what I wrote on September 19. There were actually 2 close elections over the weekend with very similar results for their currencies, negative. It's strange and ironic that the markets wanted both incumbents out and were disappointed when that didn't happen and that the final outcome may not be known for weeks. The elusive, worst of both worlds, phrase is appropriate for New Zealand and Germany. But let's keep this in perspective. The GDP of Germany is 2.7 trillion and the GDP of New Zealand is 96 billion. Therefore, let's focus on our friends in Germany. In the 613-member lower house of parliament, Angela Merkel's opposition Conservative Party won 225 seats and incumbent Chancellor Gerhard Schr Diarissus Oder's Social Democrats won 222. Neither has a clear majority and they must partner with junior parties to form a government. They have a month to do it before the lower chamber by law has to meet and elect a chancellor. Schr Diarissus Oder's party and its junior partner. 184. Politics. 142.4%, but Merkel's party along with its junior partner FDP won only 45% of the seats. Neither can form a government without help from each other or the New Left Party, East German Communists and a splinter SPD that got 8.7% of the votes. Already the head of the FDP has rolled out a traffic light coalition of SCHR diaresis Others Social Democrats, the Green Party, and the FDP. This is ugly. A grand coalition of both parties is going to be very difficult to form and almost impossible to administer. As I wrote in the Globe and Mail, my newspaper column, on Friday, the groups that are going to get zapped are the investors. Unfortunately, they will continue to feel the impact of a failed domestic program that is unable to cope with an anemic economy, heavy outsourcing, and an aging population that will cause serious strain on their social safety net system. After Sunday, I'm guessing they will slide out of that country to an alternative country like Japan. The euro currency sank, as did the DAX, for the month of October as the two sides attempted to hammer out a compromise. This indecision on the election was eerily similar to what had occurred during the US 2000 election. In this case, the opposition parties had to agree to a coalition that included representation from both groups. On October 10, a compromise was reached with Angela Merkel as the new chancellor and an even split of the 16 cabinet seats between the CDU, CSU and the SPD. With the uncertainty removed, the stock market powered higher as the coalition promised to cut public spending and to cut employment protection during the first 2 years on the job. Here's what I wrote after the coalition was formed. Of course, it helps the buck when Europe has self-inflicted political wounds like what's going on in Germany. The Christian Democrats CDU Angela Merkel has finally been named the new German chancellor in a power-sharing deal with the opposition's Social Democrats SPD. The deal has the CDU controlling the chancellorship, the cabinet-level chief of staff post, and 6 cabinet seats while the SPD gets 8 cabinet posts. This almost ensures that Merkel's pledges of tax cuts and labor reform will at best be seriously watered down and at worst not happen at all. This should translate into years more of double-digit unemployment and sideways GDP. Merkel herself wasn't too excited at the prospects. At a news conference, Merkel announced the terms of the coalition, but almost neglected to mention the fact that she would become chancellor. While she read the 4-minute statement, she didn't smile once. It's like the old joke about the prizes of contest no one wants to win. First prize is government change. 185. A week in Cleveland, and second prize is 2 weeks. Merkel won the election, but really got 2 weeks in Cleveland. The impact from this event covered the time from when the election was called for until when the election was finally settled. In these forms of government, the campaigning is relatively short compared to the United States primary system. In this German event, the impact on the financial markets was primarily seen in the stock market as the election evolved around changes to the tax and social payment structure of the government. The German bond market suffered from anticipation of faster German growth along with the European Central Bank raising rates. The generic German 10-year government bond figure 10.9 saw the yields hit their lows over the uncertainty of the outcome of the election in late September. Then, the yields went up from there and reached a peak in mid-2006. This somewhat flies in the face of the theory that bonds should perform better during a coalition or gridlock government than during a unified one. In this case, the Germans had a unique situation in which both parties campaigned in similar reform issues and reducing social spending. In other words, it didn't matter who won as both were going to attempt to enact legislation that was bond market friendly. This was really going to be a question. Figure 10.9 German generic 10-year government bond source, used with permission from Bloomberg LP. 186. Politics. Of who won with how large a mandate. Mandates from the electorate are critical for providing the impetus for pushing change through the system. Refer back to the 1994 U.S. midterm elections. I seriously doubt that the Republicans would have been able to enact their 10 points in 100 days without the backing of a major victory in the midterm elections, especially with a Democratic president. As of this writing, Merkel's grand coalition honeymoon is over, and not much has been accomplished. As of written, the markets had hoped that there would be positive change and that the government would lift the Eurozone's largest economy out of the ditch. Unfortunately, they made no strides in reforming Social Security or in reforming the rigidity of the labor market. The biggest step they have taken is to raise the retirement age to 67, eventually. This is the mouse in the snake routine. For the longer-term 2050, the Eurozone population will grow dramatically as low fertility rates and longer life expectancy will eventually drive the dependency ratio of those who work ages 16 to 63 to those who don't below 16 and above 63 from 50% to 80%. The point is that the current government hasn't had the will or the mandate from the voters to change the system to address these long-term issues. No one wants to have their taxes raised, nor does anyone want to limit the social safety net to protect them during periods of unemployment. To use a cliché, this is a slow-burning fuse on a bomb that will explode eventually with massive costs the longer the day of reckoning is put off. CPWT, Championship Political Wrestling.